Morning, it's August 16th, 2015. My name's Johann Koehler. I'm a graduate student at the University of California, Berkeley School of Law. I'm here on behalf of the Oral History of Criminology project. I'm delighted to be joined by Tony Platt, who is a professor of social work emeritus at California State University, Sacramento, and a distinguished scholar at the Center for the Study of Law and Society, also at the University of California, Berkeley. So, Tony, I'd like to begin going back to before criminology was even on the horizon. I'd like to see what brought you to criminology in the first place. If we can start with your upbringing. Can we go back to Manchester and tell us, is there anything about your family, anything about your experiences growing up in Manchester that, of all things, brought you, this might be a surprise to some listeners, to study law, of all things, as though you were going to train to be a lawyer as an undergraduate at Oxford. So can you tell us what brought you to the point where you thought, law, that's what I'm going to go study?
Thanks. Thank you for the invitation. I'm glad to be here talking about this history. So I grew up in Manchester. I was born in the middle of World War II. I was born in 1942, so I had my childhood years and then my adolescent years growing up in Manchester. I went to Manchester Grammar School, which was an important place for sort of creaming off 10 and 11-year-olds from the surrounding schools and preparing them for college and university. It didn't happen very much in England in those days, but that was a sort of a fast track to success as long as you kept your nose clean and did what you were supposed to do. And I grew up in a family that was Jewish, secular, progressive. Both my parents had been communists when they were young, and then they rejected communism when the revelations came out about Stalin, but they remained very progressive. So the household I grew up in, a lot of discussions about politics, a lot of critiques of racism in the United States, apartheid in South Africa, of the prisons and capital punishment, which was still in place then, and all kinds of literature and magazines and journals that were in the household that I was exposed to. And also people came to visit my family and talk about global issues. So I grew up, even though it was a somewhat provincial part of England, I grew up exposed to a variety of ideas. And also I was part of that post-war generation that was born into the counterculture or into cultural rebellion and political rebellion. So those two things came together, my family background and influence, and being born into that rebellious generation that affected a lot of middle-class kids like myself. But I didn't know what I wanted to do in high school. I was very much into sports. I wanted to go to university, but I didn't have a clear idea what I wanted to do. And because I didn't have a clear idea, my parents said, well, you should go into law and, and then become a lawyer. And so I sort of followed their advice. I think if I was doing that again, I would do history. And later on, when I reached grad school, I realized that history was my first love. So I went to Oxford to study jurisprudence, not by any kind of conscious choice that this was a direction to go in, but because it was a failure to choose something else at the time.
Can you share with us a little bit about your time at Oxford? Was it during your time at Oxford that you decided perhaps law isn't really where I belong, perhaps, say, history is, or perhaps, say, criminology or sociology or something else? Was it something that happened at Oxford that made you think beyond law?
Oxford wasn't a particularly comfortable place for me. We're now talking about 1960 to 63. And even though I grew up in a household that was very cosmopolitan and I'd traveled different places with my family, been exposed to a range of ideas, I still didn't feel very comfortable at Oxford as a student. Jews, there was no longer any formal anti-Semitism in Oxford or other places, but there was certainly a sense that, Oxford is not really a place that's hospitable to Jews, not particularly hospitable to people from Northern England either, even though I came from a very middle-class background. The sense was that Oxford was southern England. It was private schools. It was Christian. So I always felt a little bit at odds when I was there, but I really threw myself into sports. I was very active in sports. I went to political events. I went to demonstrations against the bomb campaign for nuclear disarmament. I hung out with people playing jazz, smoking marijuana, like Howie Becker a few years later would teach us how to do. And I was very dissatisfied with being in law school, in part because my professor was a man named Yardley, was a right-wing intellectual, pro-death penalty, pro-punishment, and so on. So I was actually surprised to find that the first piece that I actually ever published, when I was going back looking for earlier work that I'd done, I found the first piece that I ever published was in a magazine called ISIS, which is, I guess still exists, the Oxford magazine. And it's a piece about the need for rehabilitation. So it's a critique of the prison system in England and why rehabilitation is a good thing. I revisited and wrote about that piece more recently. So I think I was critical of the prison system, but I was also interested in a wide variety of things. And then when I thought of like going on to grad school, it was not so much about just moving into a new field that I could learn, but also to get away from England. At that time I had a very tense relationship with my patriarchal father. I wanted to leave Manchester, I wanted to leave England. I didn't really know where I was going. By accident I met a man from Berkeley called Ted Sabin, who was actually a psychologist. He was in the psychology department at Berkeley, did interesting work on psychology and crime. He gave a guest lecture there, and I went and talked to him after the lecture.
This is while you were still at Oxford?
Yeah, I was still there. I was a student at Oxford. And I said, if I went on and did graduate studies, where should I go? And he says, well, you should either go to Harvard or to Berkeley. And at that point, I knew nothing about Berkeley. But I did know that I was attracted to the West Coast. I was attracted to the beat movement and the poetry, and the articles were coming out. I was reading that material. So San Francisco for me was a very important place culturally that I want to be. And also when I looked at the map, I realized that Berkeley was a lot further away from my home in England than Harvard was. So I chose Berkeley. So it was those kinds of decisions that are really accidental, serendipitous, not really well thought through. And the two areas of law that I studied at Oxford that I was really interested in were criminal law and international law, and also philosophy of law. So I thought, how could I get into a graduate program that drew upon certain of those elements so I don't totally waste my undergraduate work? So I applied to Berkeley and came to Berkeley in 1963.
This gives us a pretty good sense of why Berkeley and why California.
Yeah.
Why the Criminology School, of all of the programs available to you, having been given this, having been steeped in Yardley's center-right jurisprudential vision and finding it wanting, what made you think criminology, of all of the departments to apply to, that's where I think I might possibly find a home?
I think, again, it was because I was really interested in the criminal law, and then the criminal law got me interested in prisons and the fact that I'd written about that. And then hearing that one lecture and going up and getting this person's advice. I don't think there was anything more thought through or conscious about the decision. It was really that sort of casual kind of decision that made that. And my idea was then I'd travel, I'd get to go to the West Coast, I could go and listen to the beat poets and visit all the shrines of the beat movement and poetry that I was really excited about. This is before there's a student movement at Berkeley, so Berkeley's not particularly associated with activism, though I think I'd read about the protests against HUAC that took place in San Francisco before I came over there. But it was really San Francisco, and then something that I could use my interest as an undergraduate in something that would get me into a grad school.
Right. So you arrive in Berkeley about 63.
Yeah.
And it makes some sense that you arrive at the School of Criminology that had, at the time, was populated with a faculty that had quite a few lawyers. But I'd like to ask you, what was it like when you first arrived at Berkeley? Because was it what you expected?
It wasn't what I expected, but I didn't really have a clear idea of what I expected. I remember getting a taxi with all our luggage coming from the San Francisco airport into Berkeley, over to Berkeley for the first time, and the cab driver looks in the mirror, looks at me and says, "Boy, are you green?"
What did he mean?
He meant like, I'm coming into a totally strange, different world, you know, where I don't know what I'm coming into. And California did very much seem to me like a very different place than what I'd experienced. I'd grown up all my life in Manchester. I'd spent 3 uncomfortable years at Oxford. I'd read a great deal about the United States. But I was familiar with the literature that came out of San Francisco, particularly the Beat movement. But and I'd done a little bit of research on Berkeley, but I didn't really know what I was coming into. And so, and also I didn't understand at that point that there was great interest in me in Berkeley, not so much about what I knew or what I thought or what my abilities were, but what I symbolized. Because there were very few graduate students coming from England at that time on the West Coast, and even fewer ones coming from Oxford. So I was sort of a feather in their cap that they got me. At the time I had no clue about that. I didn't realize that there was a snobbery about this, or that this was a big deal for them to get me to come there. And they had all these illusions about what Oxford was. And also, because my name Platt is also a very old name of British gentry, they probably assumed that I, you know, came from generations of Brits as opposed to being the grandchildren of illiterate Jewish immigrants from Poland and Romania. So from their perspective, and this I found out later on, I was sort of the British graduate, you know, Oxford representative in the grad school. So I was very warmly greeted and told, you know, this is what you have to do. You have to go and take all these courses. I had to take some undergraduate courses, which were mind-numbingly infantile, and then started taking graduate classes.
So tell us, within a few months even of your arrival at Berkeley, things kick off.
They do.
Free speech movement.
Right.
What's riot by the time you've acquired your master's degree?
65, yeah.
A few months after you've acquired your master's. What's riot's August, so it would have been a few months after you've acquired your master's degree. Slew of presidential commissions.
Yeah.
Things have kicked off by the time you get to Berkeley. Can you tell us about your time as a graduate student at Berkeley?
Incredible time. I mean, couldn't ask for a better time. To be in a field that I now knew I wanted to study, to be doing intellectual work that I was interested in, to have colleagues who were also doing very interesting work in the graduate program. I mean, I thought I was there for a year to get a master's degree and then go back like a lot of immigrants. But it was very compelling, and then a political, cultural atmosphere where what was going on in the classroom and in the ideas that you had in grad school were replicated outside the door of the classroom, outside of the building. So for me, this was a cultural, political, intellectual moment where things came together. I mean, I was still an outsider, I was still a foreigner, and I was still, in that first year in particular, staying for a year and going back. So it was only a gradual decision. In fact, I didn't make a final decision until my postdoc about not coming back to England. But it was also a moment because in 1964 I started working as a research assistant and got money from the Law and Society Center, which had only been open a few years. It was the beginning of the Law and Society movement. And I was over there, and at the Law and Society Center, all these people came through, as they still do today, to give papers and to give talks and to debate issues. It was, the room was always packed. There was lots of discussion and debate. I mean, today a lot of the presenters and a lot of the discussion tends to be very polite and very civil, but in those days there was lots of arguments and debates and back and forths. So it was an incredible time and moment to be in grad school and studying those issues. And also there was a great deal of interest in revisionist history outside of criminology and history itself. So I was getting exposed to sociology, to the new history that was emerging. all of those things came together, which helped me then select a dissertation topic and so on.
I'd like to move to who some of the important figures were that you started encountering, perhaps as a graduate student at Berkeley, maybe even earlier during your time at Oxford. But I'd like to start getting a sense of, at least for the early Tony Platt, who were some of the thinkers that started shaping your outlook?
Well, I'd say in broader historical terms, people like Gabriel Kolko, who was writing revisionist histories of the progressive era that then influenced my work on the child savers. Jim Weinstein, who was a local historian, did important work. In sociology, people like Goffman, Matza, Kornhauser, Selznick, and then all the people that would come through, the labeling theory people that would come through and give talks and so on. So there was, I think probably the labeling theorists made the most sense to me, and as grad students began to, in the Berkeley Crim School, even though it was still a fairly monolithic program, and that there were certain expectations about what you did, there were also the beginning of a sociological tendency within criminology, and people were actively studying labeling theory and Lemmet and Becker and those kinds of people. So those were very influential.
And can you give us some portrait of the status of labeling theory at the time? It was inchoate by this point at Berkeley. It was established. What was the status? What were the critiques at this point strong? Can you give us a sense of what you described the fervent intellectual parry and riposte at the Center for the Study of Law and Society?
Yeah.
Perhaps you can ground this for us in an example, perhaps the theories that were ascendant at the time?
I would say that in criminology at the time I was a grad student, that sociological theory was in ascendancy. The criminology school was an interesting mixture of old-style law enforcement, ex-cops, criminalist people who were in criminology, and then a grouping of sociologists and people, and psychologists as well. But Joe Lohman, who was the dean at the time, he came out of the Chicago School of Sociology. He was also very well connected in Washington, D.C., and was seen as a liberal reformer, bringing in money into the criminology school. But I remember taking a class from him, and where all the major theories that he taught were all sociological, and that you were then encouraged to go into sociology and take classes there, or sit in on classes, or go to seminars led by sociologists. So I'd say it was very pluralistic, but for somebody like myself, sociological, particularly labeling theory, Sickerel, Lemmet, Becker, all those kinds of people, were seen as being totally authentic part of this emerging criminology.
And then we get to your selection of a dissertation.
Yeah.
Can you bring us to that point? How did you happen upon your dissertation project?
I don't remember the specifics of how that happened. So I know I started off very interested and wrote my master's thesis on the history of legal definitions of insanity. So I'm already very much attracted to historical work. In fact, there's very few things I've written in my whole career that doesn't involve historical research. Very, very few, maybe 2 or 3 articles or something. Except for my political writings and my more, agitational writings. So, I was encouraged when I was in grad school to continue to do historical work because I was seen as somehow, I don't know, maybe having some expertise in that because I came from England and Oxford and so on. Not necessarily true, but I was really interested in historical work. And I was interested in revisionist history and so the work I did on the history of the mentally ill and mental definitions of insanity, working with Bernard Diamond, a psychiatrist, was on trying to understand how contemporary definitions of mental illness in the legal system emerged and developed. So I think when I was looking around then for a dissertation topic, I think it was probably in a conversation with David Matza. He says, well, what about the juvenile court? So He had me go off and read everything that had been written about the history of the juvenile court.
Was there a lot?
There was a lot, a huge literature on the juvenile court. All benevolent, progressive, what a wonderful institution it was. And, you know, I knew from my own experiences of what was going on in juvenile court and juvenile institutions that this just seemed like an incredibly rosy picture. So, but it turned out that kind of revisionist investigations of the past were going on in a number of places. Piven and Clower did their important book, Regulating the Poor, a little bit later, I think, but they did that work about revisioning and reinvestigating the so-called benevolent history of the welfare system. There was a lot of critical work going on the rise of public education and the progressive development of education, reinterpreting the public school as an institution of social control. So that was in the atmosphere from the historians. And then the labeling theorists were always saying, you know, study the people that are doing the label. You know, we've had enough studying of the criminals and why did Johnny go wrong and what's going on in the brain and the blood of the criminals and so on. We need to study the institutions. So those two things came together, my interest in history, the fact that there was a good atmosphere of people doing a variety of work in that area, and then this topic had not been done by anybody.
The resultant work, titled The Child Savers, The Invention of Delinquency, is the book for which most criminologists will most associate your life's work. It was first published in 1969, again with a lovely reprint, new edition for the 40th anniversary. It's been an important work for a lot of people, but I'm curious, when you reflect on the 40 years, well, now more than 40 years, since having written it, perhaps we can first start with just the argument. The argument that you put forward in the book, how would you characterize it?
The argument is that most of the histories of the juvenile court at that time argued that the juvenile court represented a liberal, benevolent institution, that it was countering a very punitive history in the 19th century, that it was setting up a sort of social work model of the way you should deal with young people to get in trouble with the law, that it was doing away with due process on the right to lawyers and constitutional rights because this was going to be in the best interests of the child. And so the book takes on that mythology by, first of all, showing that, in fact, the juvenile court system, as it developed with the reformatories and the youth prisons, was actually a very punitive and intrusive system, and that it was really one of several institutions developed to regulate and control urban working class youth. The book also took on the argument that a lot of people were critical of what happened to the juvenile court in its aftermath, but said it was really well intentioned, it was a really great idea, and whatever problems have existed with it happened because people are not perfect in the way in which they implement things, and that things went wrong administratively. I argued that ideologically, culturally, politically, from the very beginning, that this was a very tough set of institutions designed to expand the net of social control over urban working class.
And as a 70-year-old institution by this point, from 1899 to the point of publication, 1969, a lot's happened. In particular, 2 years before it's published, before the book is published.
Well, the book got a mixed reception in criminology. Some people thought it was, a great and a breakthrough. Some people were very critical and thought they overstated it. I think to this day, Lawrence Friedman and his magisterial work on the history of the criminal law says that The Child Saver was, one-sided and overly harsh and overly critical and so on. And that it was what was the word that he used? Not sarcastic, but anyway, he had a critique of my motivation for writing it. But it also, again, it's like my decision about, why to leave England and what to do when I came to Berkeley and so on. There's certain serendipity at work here. I mean, when I started the work, I didn't know that the Supreme Court was going to take on this issue and have these major decisions. And so it fit what was going on in legal circles, a whole legal debate. And when I went around and talked about the dissertation, then later on the book, people were very receptive to it. It made total sense. And I wouldn't say that when it came out, or when the book came out originally, that it was widely accepted. There was a lot of critical reviews of it and so on. But eventually it sort of became the standard interpretation. So now, unfortunately, it's part of the establishment view of the history of juvenile justice. So you read textbooks and you're going to find a little summary of the child savers or a chapter from the book or whatever. It became sort of the new way of thinking about the past.
Do you think it's withstood the test of time then?
Well, a few years ago, I was really glad to see that a number of younger scholars were finally returning to this field. People have not really worked in the history of juvenile justice, and so that's one reason the book kept being used and stood the test of time, is because other scholars weren't working in this area. So I was actually very glad to hear that young scholars, young historians were now beginning to look at a variety of different aspects of the book, and also were developing critiques of it. So I started to work with them, to take an interest in their work. Somebody like Jeff Ward, whose book The Black Child Savers came out not too long ago. I read his dissertation. I gave him ideas about how to develop it when it developed into a book. I had lots of conversations with him. And my attitude was about time, because I think the book has its limits, speaks to the moment that I wrote it, and that there's a need for a lot more work to be done. So when the new generation of historians began to develop their histories, which were in part a critique of the child savers, I then was very glad that they were willing to have those critiques be part of the new edition of the book and keep that conversation going.
You mentioned a moment ago that that when you wrote The Child Savers, it was, I think the words you just used were, it was particular to the moment in which it was written.
Mm.
I'd like to talk a little bit more about that moment.
Mm.
In 1974, a few years after you graduated from Berkeley, you published in the journal Crime and Social Justice, a journal that you helped found, an article entitled Prospects for a Radical Criminology in the United States.
Mm.
In it you wrote, I'm just going to quote a very brief excerpt here, "Criminology as an academic discipline has typically reflected and reinforced the values of the state." Is this the moment that you're referring to, or is there something that I'm missing out with that characterization? Is there, when you refer to the moment that you're trying to respond to with a work like The Child Savers, is that the moment that you're trying to push up against?
I think there's two different moments. I think there's the moment in my development and work in the late 60s and early 70s, when writing a book like The Child Savers speaks to a larger intellectual sets of activities that are going on in lots of different places, going on in history, going on in social work, going on in sociology, going on in criminology. And that, so this work speaks to that moment where people are beginning to be open to revisionist ideas of the past. Remember, this is the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement and the women's movement in particular not just produced all kinds of social movements and critiques of existing society, but people began to ask the question, how do we come to this place? Where did racism come from? Why is it still a problem? Why are women still second-class citizens? Why are we at war? Is this an exceptional war? Is it a different kind of war, or is there a whole pattern of that? So for those of us in the university, we were being pushed to try to look at the historical precursors of what we were interested in, like where did this come from? So that's what I mean by being this revisionist moment, my book on The Child Savers and other people's book were not only questioning the development of specific institutions, but looking at that whole important period of American history at the end of the 19th, the beginning of the 20th century, the beginning of the rise of the United States as a world power. Mm-hmm. Where did that power come from? How is it justified? What are the mythologies about it? So that's that particular moment.
We're going to be talking about Child Savers more, but I want to bring us back for a moment to the chronology of your own biography for a moment.
Yeah.
You graduate, you filed the dissertation in 1966.
Yeah.
You have a job. You move to a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Chicago.
Yeah.
At the law school, do I understand?
At the law school.
Where you were taught by none other than who was the man leading it at the time? It was Norval Morris, was it
Yeah,
not?
I wasn't taught by him, though.
Okay, all right.
Okay.
But he was your boss.
He was my boss, and Hans Maddock was the administrator of it was a center for criminal justice research in the law school. Norval Morris was the director of that center as well as a law professor, yes.
You eventually returned 2 years thereafter to the same institution, the same department where you got your doctorate.
Yes.
But is there anything you want to share with us about the 2 years you spent at the University of Chicago with Norval Morris and Hans Maddock?
I would say those 2 years in Chicago were probably the most important years in my political, cultural, intellectual development. So I got there in '66, and I left in 1968. And in that period, you have the murder of Martin Luther King and the riots that take place all over the country, in particular huge ones in Chicago, protests. You have the Democratic Convention that takes place in Chicago. The whole world is watching, and the political movement that came out of that, the anti-war movement that came out of that. So again, being at Oxford, particularly being in the law school, reminded me a lot of being actually at Oxford, in the same way that many years later when I went to the Huntington Library also reminded me of those experiences. It wasn't a comfortable experience being in the law school. I was constantly asked for my ID and security checks at the door when I'd go in, even though I was a doctorate and I was actually the research director of a whole project. But the law school was very much sort of an oasis in Chicago, and in fact there were serious debates just before I arrived at Chicago about whether the university should move to another city or another place because of the dangerousness of Chicago, surrounded by a very, very large working class black community. So for me, there was a lot of discomfort in the law school, just feeling at odds with this university sort of almost being part of a sort of a colonial sensibility. When there were riots or major protests in Chicago, the university would send out messages saying to the faculty, who were almost exclusively white male faculty, make sure that you send your wives and children out of town during the protests and the demonstration. And that sense of like being in a colonial outpost. But outside the university, this was an extraordinary time because the research and work I did there was based in one of the urban black communities in Chicago. And for very odd reasons, I was treated very well by black political activists and black community leaders because they assumed that I was an American, and I guess they didn't realize that England has a long, long history of racism against black people. But so I sort of got a pass because I was seen as being, a foreigner, an outsider. So I had an extraordinary experience getting to know people in black organizations and black community. And then in '68, when a lot of people were arrested after the killing of Martin Luther King, I helped to organize a bail fund, working with black community leaders there. So in terms of learning about race, working in the black community, developing an understanding of racism, that was a profoundly important time in my life. And at the same time, I ended up very alienated from the law school and from Norval Morris and the powers that be in the law school, because I think their expectation of me was, British, Oxford, Berkeley, doctorate, postdoc. I was like this rising star. I was very young. I had all the right pedigree. This was like going to be a stage in my academic career when I was going to move up. And
Child Savers was making murmurs by this point.
It was. The Child Savers was now, I was almost at this point sick of going around giving talks about the Child Savers. It was like, enough of the Child Savers, or teaching about the Child Savers. So, and I taught a course about the Child Savers in the, what do they call it, Social Service Administration Department at the University of Chicago, where Peggy Rosenheim and some other interesting people were. But my political activities in the black community and the fact that I was later on I found out, being watched by the local Red Squad in the city and so on. All of that was, I think, upsetting to the powers that be in the law school. This is not the appropriate way to act. So when I left, after 2 years there, it was a tense departure.
And you left to return to the very department that awarded you the PhD, the DCrim, 2 years earlier.
I was going to go, at that point, I was definitely going back to England. I was married, I had a child, I was on the job market, and I'd been taught how to deal with the job market American style. Here I was on my doctorate from Berkeley, my postdoc from Chicago. The university was expanding, there were jobs everywhere. So I was on the job market, and I applied to England as well, and actually got offered a job at Exeter. And at that point was probably going to go back to England. I was very torn. My wife at the time, I was married to, wanted to go back. And then I got offered a job at Berkeley. So that sort of decided it.
Well, all right. Now I must ask. At this point in the late 60s, was there an identifiably different outlook between American and British or European criminology? Did that figure into the decision at all? Because I left Oxford after getting a law degree as an undergraduate, I was not in criminology. I didn't study British criminology. Now, I did, when I was in the United States, in the crim school, I would study the Cambridge School and Rudzinowitz, and I was reading all the histories I could find, that anybody in criminology doing history. So I was reading a bunch of the stuff coming out of the Cambridge School. But I really wasn't an expert on it. But by the time I got back to Berkeley in '68, from '68 onwards, when there was all this ferment politically, culturally, but also in the university, I began then to have contacts with a lot of people in criminology programs in Europe. So it's at that point that I begin to get a sense of the debates and battles that are going on in Italy and England and France and everywhere else, Scandinavia. Okay, so you arrive back at Berkeley in 1968.
Yeah.
This time, however, as a frocked assistant professor.
Indeed.
You have a faculty vote. You are one of the power holders at this point. What's it like?
Exciting. Fantastic. It was like a dream job back in Berkeley. Assistant professor, political movement, finding like-minded professors that I could work with, people like Paul Takagi and Barry Crisberg and other people that came through, and then, finding graduate students just hungry for all these new developments and debates taking place in not just in criminology, but taking place throughout the social sciences. Teaching courses that I wanted to teach, writing stuff I wanted to teach, being now much more involved politically. I came back with a much stronger political commitment. When I was a graduate student, I had political ideas and supported different kinds of political movements, but I still felt like I'm here temporarily, I'm a foreigner, I'm trying to figure things out. But by the experience in Chicago, by the time I came back to Berkeley, I saw myself as a political activist who also happened to be a professor and a criminologist.
And it's an exciting time again. In 1968, Johnson's passed his omnibus crime bill.
Yeah.
You've got the LEAA, which is massively expanded funding to criminal justice and criminology doctoral programs.
Yeah.
You now find yourself in a criminology school. Only 2 years thereafter, Nixon establishes the Commission on Campus Unrest.
Right.
Universities are an exciting place to be. Can you tell us a little bit about your time?
It's a very exciting time because everything that I believed in and taught was also a part of my political practice. So this sense of leading a life where you're teaching one thing in the classroom, you're trying to implement those ideas in the community, you're participating in political debates. For a while I lived in a commune when I was a young professor as well, an urban commune that was also a political collective. So it felt like living a totally integrated life, a life where you left work and you went into the community and you went from the community to work, and that they were highly integrated. Plus you had groups of graduate students who were excited about this as well, who came in being very moved by the times, 1968, by the political, social, cultural movements, and then find themselves in classrooms getting training and ideas that supported what they thought too. But still, the School of Criminology, some people argue that it was sort of like taken over by the left. The School of Criminology was actually a very pluralistic place, even at its most politically active. You still had a criminalistics program. You still had old-line cops. You still had liberal sociologists in the Joe Lohman mold who, supported the Democratic Party and wanted to work through the institutions of power. And even amongst activists, you had a fairly pluralistic set of interests. You had a really interesting group of professional activists who wanted to go into policing, who wanted to go into prison work, who wanted to go into serious criminology programs and make changes. You had people like Dick Hongisto, who was a student in the criminology school, who eventually became the sheriff of San Francisco.
Was instrumental in hiring gay and queer public officials to important positions. One of the first the first, as I understand it, in San Francisco to do so.
Yeah, had visited Cuba and was impressed by what was going on in Cuba.
Mimi Silbert,
who didn't found Delancey Street, but after a few years working with John Marr, the founder of Delancey Street, basically ran it from then until now. She's still running it. One of the most innovative halfway house programs in the country. You had Tom Merton, who went on to become the head of the prison system in Arkansas.
After exposing the scandal in prisons in maybe it was also Arkansas,
where he found all the bodies buried in the back of the prison and exposed that. And
at Lee Brown.
Lee Brown, one of the first African American police administrators. The radical wing, of which I was a part, and those people would have our arguments and debates, but that was also going on. In that sense, it was a very pluralistic program. This myth that got created afterwards that the left wrecked the criminology school is not borne out by the reality. Yes, there were fierce arguments and debates and shouting and all of that, but it was is really what a university department should be in theory, a place of debate and dialogue and argument and so on. There were a lot of hard feelings that came out of that whole experience because people had a stake in the criminology school before it got closed down. But for a short moment there, it really represented the ideal of what it means to create a pluralist university with a variety of viewpoints and ideas.
During the time that you're a faculty member at the Berkeley Criminology School, that very school becomes the epicenter of radical criminology in the United States. In 1973, the Union of Radical Criminologists becomes established.
Right.
In 1974, you establish with a few other members of the school the journal Crime and Social Justice, which in 1980 changes its name, 1988.
I forget the exact date.
I think it's 1988, changes its name to Social Justice. It's still running. Can you tell us about establishing the journal? Was this in response to something, maybe a paucity of scholarship being produced in the tradition of radical criminology at the time? Can you tell us about the origins of the journal?
Well, we did what any political organizers do. You create organizations, you create lines of communication, you create journals. This is long before email and the internet and the web. You create journals so that you can communicate and find like-minded people. You hold many conferences. All of those things were about trying to build an organization. And as the criminology school itself came under attack, and we'll probably come to that in a minute, and got eliminated, that became more and more important, like how to continue this base of operations outside of the School of Criminology, so we didn't just totally rely on that. So we set up a Center for Criminal Justice Research that produced the Iron Fist and Velvet Glove. That was a collaborative effort. Also there were many other progressive journals being established at that time. This is what you did in sociology and political science and economics. You You produced left journals, you went to conferences, you found people at conferences that were interested in the work you were doing and subscribed to the journal and became part of a network and so on. Mm-hmm. So it was part of the work of political organizing. It wasn't just specific to criminology.
That brings me neatly to the last question I wanted to ask before getting to 1976, that problematic year. You've mentioned at a few points, just now being one of them, the work that was being done in the classroom and out of the classroom.
Yeah.
You were a participant in both of these worlds. Can you share with us some of this, straddling both of these worlds? Was that part of your scholarship? In fact, perhaps it's probably best if you just start by describing what these two worlds were, in the classroom and out the classroom.
Yeah, I think what's important to understand is that the work that went on that eventually sort of became the standard interpretation. So now, unfortunately, it's part of the establishment view of the history of juvenile justice. So you read textbooks and you're going to find a little summary of the child savers or a chapter from the book or whatever. It became sort of the new way of thinking about the past.
Do you think it's withstood the test of time then?
Well, a few years ago, I was really glad to see that a number of younger scholars were finally returning to this field. People have not really worked in the history of juvenile justice, and so that's one reason the book kept being used and stood the test of time, is because other scholars weren't working in this area. So I was actually very glad to hear that young scholars, young historians, were now beginning to look at a variety of different aspects of the book and also were developing critiques of it. So I started to work with them, to take an interest in their work. Somebody like Jeff Ward, whose book The Black Child Savers came out not too long ago. I read his dissertation. I gave him ideas about how to develop it when it developed into a book. I had lots of conversations with him. And my attitude was about time, because I think the book has its limits. It speaks to the moment that I wrote it, and that there's a need for a lot more work to be done. So when the new generation of historians began to develop their histories, which were in part a critique of the child savers, I then was very glad that they were willing to have those critiques be part of the new edition of the book and keep that conversation going.
You mentioned a moment ago that that when you wrote The Child Savers, it was, I think the words you just used were, it was particular to the moment in which it was written. I'd like to talk a little bit more about that moment. In 1974, a few years after you graduated from Berkeley, you published in the journal Crime and Social Justice, a journal that you helped found, an article entitled Prospects for a Radical Criminology in the United States. In it you wrote, I'm just going to quote a very brief excerpt here, "Criminology as an academic discipline has typically reflected and reinforced the values of the state." Is this the moment that you're referring to, or is there something that I'm missing out with that characterization? Is there, when you refer to the moment that you're trying to respond to with a work like The Child Savers, is that the moment that you're trying to push up against?
I think there's two different moments. I think there's the moment in my development and work in the late 60s and early 70s, when writing a book like The Child Savers speaks to a larger intellectual sets of activities that are going on in lots of different places, going on in history, going on in social work, going on in sociology, going on in criminology. And that, so this work speaks to that moment where people are beginning to be open to revisionist ideas of the past. Remember, this is the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement and the women's movement in particular not just produced all kinds of social movements and critiques of existing society, but people began to ask the question, how did we come to this place? Where did racism come from? Why is it still a problem? Why are women still second-class citizens? Why are we at war? Is this an exceptional war? Or is it a different kind of war? Or is there a whole pattern of that? So for those of us in the university, we were being pushed to try to look at the historical precursors of what we were interested in, like where did this come from? So that's what I mean by being this revisionist moment, my book on the child savers and other people's book were not only questioning the development of specific institutions, but looking at that whole important period of American history at the end of the 19th, the beginning of the 20th century, the beginning of the rise of the United States as a world power. Where did that power come from? How is it justified? What are the mythologies about it? So that's that particular moment.
We're going to be talking about child savers more, but I want to bring us back for a moment to the chronology of your own biography for a moment.
Yeah.
You graduate, you filed the dissertation in 1966.
Yeah.
You have a job. You move to a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Chicago.
Yeah.
At the law school, do I understand?
At the law school.
Where you were taught by none other than who was the man leading it at the time? It was Norval Morris, was it?
Yeah, I wasn't taught by him.
Okay, all right.
Okay.
But he was your boss.
He was my boss, and Hans Maddock was the administrator of it was a center for criminal justice research in the law school. Norval Morris was the director of that center as well as a law professor, yes.
You eventually returned 2 years thereafter to the same institution, the same department where you got your doctorate.
Yes.
But is there anything you want to share with us about the 2 years you spent at the University of Chicago with Norval Morris and Hans Maddock?
I would say those 2 years in Chicago were probably the most important years in my political, cultural, intellectual development. So I got there in '66, and I left in 1968. And in that period, you have the murder of Martin Luther King and the riots that take place all over the country, in particular huge ones in Chicago, protests. You have the Democratic Convention that takes place in Chicago. The whole world is watching, and the political movement that came out of that, the anti-war movement that came out of that. So again, being at Oxford, particularly being in the law school, reminded me a lot of being actually at Oxford, in the same way that many years later when I went to the Huntington Library also reminded me of those experiences. It wasn't a comfortable experience being in the law school. I was constantly asked for my ID and security checks at the door when I'd go in, even though I was a doctorate and I was actually the research director of the whole project. But the law school was very much sort of an oasis in Chicago, and in fact there were serious debates just before I arrived at Chicago about whether the university should move to another city or another place because of the dangerousness of Chicago, surrounded by a very, very large working class black community. So for me, there was a lot of discomfort in the law school, just feeling at odds with this university sort of almost being part of a sort of a colonial sensibility. When there were riots or major protests in Chicago, the university would send out messages saying to the faculty, who were almost exclusively white male faculty, make sure that you send your wives and children out of town during the protests and the demonstration. That sense of like being in a colonial outpost. But outside the university, this was an extraordinary time because the research and work I did there was based in one of the urban black communities in Chicago, and for very odd reasons, I was treated very well by black political activists and black community leaders because they assumed that I wasn't American, and I guess they didn't realize that England has a long history of racism against black people. But so I sort of got a pass because I was seen as being, a foreigner or an outsider. So I had an extraordinary experience getting to know people in black organizations and black community. And then in '68, when a lot of people were arrested after the killing of Martin Luther King, I helped to organize a bail fund working with black community leaders there. So in terms of learning about race, working in the black community, developing an understanding of racism, that was a profoundly important time in my life. And at the same time, I ended up very alienated from the law school and from Norval Morris and the powers that be in the law school, because I think their expectation of me was, British, Oxford, Berkeley, doctorate, accused of being biased in the curriculum or not dealing with these other issues. I always used to say the same thing, that we emphasize these issues because conventional criminology doesn't, and there were plenty of courses and thousands of textbooks and articles and so on, where you can get that material if you want it. The other thing that I think happened in that moment is that not all, but a sizable number of grad students then wanted to work with those of us who were in this tendency within radical criminology. And so we attracted a lot of lively, interesting, engaged, politically committed graduate students who worked with us on dissertations and so on. And there was no doubt resentment about that and tensions about that. But still, even at the height of the radical criminology movement, and there were people in the criminology school who were progressive or liberal or critical but didn't really like our rhetoric or ideas or didn't want to be a part of that, and they had plenty of other people to choose from and to work with.
You co-taught, was it the introductory criminology class?
Yes.
With David Du Bois, the same Du Bois of the famous sociological family.
Yes.
Then one of the from the upper echelons of the Black Panther Party. Was co-teaching classes with Black Panthers a common thing in Berkeley at the time?
That was not a common thing, no. And looking back on it, it's like, how do we get away with that? But I mean, at the time, I was working with the Panthers around their ideas about community control of the police. We'd published an article that Huey Newton wrote about the police as peacekeepers. They developed a whole initiative for a very sort of Jeffersonian form of governance of policing, where the police would have to be living in the community and be accountable to elected boards in the community. We tried to implement a similar thing in Berkeley and lost at the ballot, but it was a very lively, interesting campaign. And through that work, I got to know and work with some of the Panthers that were working on issues then. And David Du Bois, who'd been in Egypt for most of his adult life, he'd been teaching and working there. David Du Bois was the son of Shirley Graham, a very important African-American leader, who later in life married Du Bois, W.B. Du Bois, and then David took on his stepfather's name. So David Du Bois and I he taught a class on colonialism and crime, and then he and I taught a class on the state and crime, and very serious, very scholarly guy. He came in the latter part of the history of the Panthers, and he really brought a whole international perspective to the Black Panther Party newspaper. But it was a serious intellectual course, and I went back and looked at the readings that we used, really interesting readings, and it was a great experience. At the time, if you'd said to me, like, isn't this like extraordinary, outrageous? I mean, why did they even allow somebody who was at that time he was the editor of the Black Panther Party newspaper to come in and teach as a lecturer at Berkeley? But at the moment, it just seemed like a totally appropriate thing to do. Came up with the idea for the class, inviting him. He had good credentials, and the department said fine. It would be unbelievable today. I mean, it would be impossible today.
We've reached the point where we have to talk about 1976, the tenure case.
Yeah.
We don't have to. Would you like to talk about the tenure case?
I'll talk about it. I don't want to. I mean, it's a bit like the child savers. I spent 10 years talking about the child savers, and then 10 years talking about the tenure case. So,
why don't you share with us what you'd like to share?
Okay. So, the narrative of what happened was that I came up for early tenure in the School of Criminology. The Child Savers was out. It was a big success. I'd also had an anthology out called The Politics of Riot Commissions. I'd worked with Jerome Skolnick on The Politics of Protest, that became a very successfully, widely used textbook in many, many classrooms, and where that book was very well received. So the department decided to put me up for early tenure. I got awarded early tenure by the department. I got awarded early tenure by the university-wide committee. And then at the University of California, Berkeley, tenure is formally granted by the regents of the university, not by the individual campuses. The regents are a statewide body with a lot of political appointees, and including the governor. And usually they rubber stamp whatever recommendations come up to them from the universities. They don't usually do their own investigation or read through the files. They just rubber stamp them. But before the regents could approved my recommendation for early tenure, I got arrested in a political demonstration. And I know you're probably thinking, like, that was probably not the best moment to choose to get arrested, but in fact I got arrested twice in one day. Admittedly now, it wasn't a good moment, but it wasn't like I tried to do that. I didn't go out deliberately to try to get myself arrested. And one case, I was accused of doing vandalism to a car owned by a police officer. My own car had also been vandalized, and I was looking at the car in front of mine that happened to belong to the cop who came and arrested me. So they dropped the vandalism charges when they realized that my car had also been vandalized. All the tires had been, the air blown out of them and taken out of them, punctured, probably by the police, because at that time I was in a very antagonistic relationship with the police because of my political views about policing. And the other arrest, I had a jury trial, got defended by a very brilliant law professor at Berkeley called Henry Ramsey, who went on to become a judge. During the course of that trial, we wanted to, in discovery, we wanted to get a document from the police department. It was an arrest report, and the police department didn't want to turn it over, and the judge says you have to turn it over because it speaks to the arrest. And I'd been beaten up when I was arrested that time, actually both times, but and I'd accused this particular cop of beating me when I was in a holding cell. And in his police report, he stupidly wrote, "I didn't beat him up, so-and-so. The other cop beat him up." So the police didn't want to turn over that report. And the judge said, well, if you don't turn over that report, the trial's over. So the DA then, it stopped midway through the jury trial, and we had a party and celebrated, and all the jury came to the party. And one of the reasons why I went through such a great deal with that case, to beat that case, was I was an immigrant. I was worried about deportation, and I was also worried that I thought that if I could clear my name in that criminal case, then there would be no bar to me getting tenure. So then the university set up a whole new tenure process. Sort of did a double jeopardy, and at that time the tenure process was incredibly secret. You didn't know the names of people that were on the committees. You didn't have access to the decision making. You couldn't do discovery and see the reports of the debates that took place. So they set up a committee that was loaded up against me, and that committee then voted me not to deny tenure, even though the earlier committee had given me tenure. So then the ACLU took that case. This is why it went on forever, another 2 years, and it lost in the appeal court. The courts at that time said, well, we cannot intervene in an academic decision around tenure unless you can show gross impropriety, which we couldn't show because we couldn't get access to the information. So it was a highly publicized trial. It preoccupied me for probably. It preoccupied me for a couple of years. It also, deeply affected my career because now I was seen as trouble. And there was an article in the Journal of Higher Education about what happened at the criminology school and what happened to me. And somebody, I think it was Bernard Diamond, saying, "Well, there's no question he's, got a good brain, is very bright and very smart, but there's no department in their right mind would want to have this man in their department." Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So that made it somewhat difficult for me to get another job.
Before we get to the point of where you landed up at Cal State Sacramento, I just want to touch briefly on the fact that the school then closed.
Yeah.
The School of Criminology it closed its doors for the last time then in 1976.
Yeah.
Looking back, I'm going to recall something you mentioned a few moments earlier, which is that there was something that worked about the way intellectual ferment was done at the criminology school that was, in your view, lost. Can you tell us, what do you think was lost?
Well, debate in criminology was lost, and praxis was lost. This sense, criminology has always had practice, but the practice of criminology has always been oriented towards people in power that run institutions. So I think what was lost, or what was really set back, was the relationship with community organizations and political organizations that radical criminology developed, and the fact that ideas were being debated in a serious way. This was going on at a variety of criminology programs and law schools and other places, but Berkeley, we had the largest concentration of people. Most departments in the 70s would allow you to have like one radical professor. Now, that was always the joke at Berkeley, that, you know, you could, who are the radical professors? Well, you know, there's Berriman in anthropology, there's so-and-so in political science. You could name them, there was always one. And I think what happened in criminology school is that we were more than one. We were never a majority, but you had somebody like Paul Takagi, who'd gone from being a liberal reformer who was radicalized by the 60s and 70s and shifted left. You had the Schwenigers, you had Chris Berg, I mean, and of course the graduate students, and then a number of the lecturers too that were in there teaching. So it was a moment where there were enough people there that you could develop a journal and hold mini conferences and have retreats and have a political debate, and you could go to other campuses and help other people set up these kinds of things. So once we lost the basic in criminology, it was very difficult to sustain that movement. But also what was going on politically around the country was really the counter-revolution, the whole defeat of the left by the mid to late 70s, the rise of Nixon and law and order and so on, is that all the social movements for equality that seemed so promising were also defeated in different ways. Repression, running out of steam, losing a political base, being isolated. So that happened to us in radical criminology as well, and then it was very, very difficult to sustain that.
After the tenure denial, you eventually found your feet again at the the Division of Social Work.
It was actually a school of social work.
Okay.
When I went there.
At the Cal State University, Sacramento.
Correct.
Where you remained from 1977 until 2008, and are now emeritus. How was that?
Well, I was very fortunate to get that job. I wanted to stay in the Bay Area. I was divorced. We had 2 children. I was co-parenting our 2 children. My ex-wife lived 3 blocks from here. So I could have gone to other places, though I was also now persona non grata. I was seen as trouble academically, like somebody
at Sacramento State, or
well, I come to Sacramento in general in criminology.
Okay.
Like you know, whatever his promise was, the man who was the child savers is no longer. He's been sort of his mind has been taken over the left. This is when I debated Jerry Skolnick at the ASC a few years ago. That was his argument. You know, you used to have such a promising mind. You did the child savers. You were so smart, and then your brain was consumed by the left, and you lost your mind. You lost your independence. You lost your critical ability. That was his view, and that was a number of other people's view. And the article in the Chronicle of Higher Education definitely made it difficult. And I really, so I didn't have a job for several months, and then a friend of mine people knew what had happened to me, so they're trying to figure out, how to help me. So a guy called Herb Cutchins, who taught in social work at the time and had done a lot of work on bail issues and other issues relating to criminology, because in social work in those days it wasn't really criminology, it was like a corrections component. It was divided up into different specialties, and there was a lot of social workers that were involved in prison work. So he said, let's try to get you a job in social work. And there was an African-American dean at the time, Jesse McClure, and he knew what had happened to me, and I was totally frank with him about what had happened. And he says, well, I want to try to shake things up here in social work. We need to bring in some debates into social work curriculum. You'd be good for that. And I also brought in Lynn Cooper, who was one of my students at Berkeley, who stayed there for the rest of her career too until she retired. And a woman called Annika Snara, who was a doctoral student in Berkeley before she went back to Scandinavia. So we brought the 3 of us in, me being the senior one. And at that time there was an African-American, a very conservative African-American president of the university. And the president had told all the deans, like, whenever you have an appointment that's problematic, or I need to be flagged and informed about it, because there may be adverse publicity, something you need to let me know. But McClure just put my application through as a routine application, and the president signed off on it. And when I forget the guy's name, but the guy who at the time was the chair of criminal justice found out I'd been hired in social work, he went to the president and said, you just hired somebody who's on FBI lists and has an FBI file and is a dangerous person. And the president then called in my dean and said, how could you do this to me? And the dean pretended like he didn't know what he was talking about. So again, that was just like another accidental moment, a moment of luck or serendipity, of how I was able to then stay living in the Bay Area. I never, we had a son who was very ill, so I had to deal with a lot of medical issues here. And so I never actually moved to Sacramento. I was always commuting back and forth. I was able to stay living in the Bay Area, be around my kids, and teach there. And there I just, I sort of changed, you know, I learned new things. I studied the history of social work, which I already knew something about because it was parallel to what I'd done in juvenile court, and Piven and Cloud were doing parallel work in social work history. So I taught the history class, I taught policy classes because I knew a lot about policy. I taught a community organizing class because I did community organizing. And even though I was part of a minority view in social work, which also can be a very conservative profession and curriculum, they gave me space for the most part to do what I wanted to do. The university was very appreciative. I got time off to do research and writing, and because I continued to research and publish and had this pedigree, you know, the England, Oxford, blah, 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 they appreciated me for that because I was publishing, and a lot of, at that time, state university professors were not publishing. So I continued to do that, and they continued to give me time, release time to do that when it was very difficult to get. So it was a very, overall it was a very good experience. I learned a new occupation, learned a new field, developed very good relationships with students. But still, it was downwardly mobile. You know, I was now teaching 4 classes instead of 1 or 2. I didn't have a research assistant, didn't have a teaching assistant, didn't have all this money to go to conferences all over the world. It was definitely a declassed experience and something of a shock to my system.
Jackson Toby once described the criminology as actually being the umbrella term for 3 different disciplines: criminology, criminal justice, and social work. You had offered a searing indictment of social work as part of your work in the Child Savers. You now found yourself in a social work school.
I know. I remember when I went there for a job interview, this one guy, I'll never forget this, he took me aside and he says, no, it was at one of the meetings when I'm presenting my ideas. He says, well, for somebody that's written a book that's so critical of social work and, you know, seems to hate social work, why do you want to teach in the social work department? Well, the answer was I was desperate for a job. I mean, I was really blacklisted in criminology. I didn't want to really move out of California unless I had to. I didn't want to go to some out-of-the-way place and be totally out of any debates and stuff. I wanted to stay in California. But, you know, I gave him the argument, though, to be critical of the history of social work doesn't mean to say I hate it, but, you know, we need a critical perspective. And the dean at the time, he'd read The Child Savers, he knew the critique, and he wanted me to bring that into social work education, so he protected me.
It reveals a lot about the state of criminology at the time, not just about your career, but about the state of the field at the time, that one of the flags that was raised about your application to Sac State was that you had an FBI file.
Yeah.
You've seen your FBI file. Can you tell us about this? What was going on there?
Well, this huge class that Takagi and Chrisberg and I taught, the Introduction to Criminology class, on the first day of that class, you know, a room packed with hundreds and hundreds of students, I'd say, well, I want to welcome everybody to this class. Really glad to have you here. Also want to welcome the informers and police agents amongst you, and all I ask is that you take accurate notes.
So you knew they were there. You knew
yes.
they had that the FBI had informants in your classes.
I didn't, but it was a pretty good guess because police agents were all over the campuses because of all the political activity that was going on. And so we were studying police intelligence operations. We had a pretty sophisticated view on how they operated. And also I had people come to me. I had one student come and confess that he was supposed to be writing reports for the police on classes, and he changed his mind and he felt very guilty. He told me about that. Another student who had worked in military intelligence, who pointed out at a demonstration to me once people that he'd seen from military intelligence earlier in his career. So it was a pretty good guess, and it was an accurate guess, because when I got my FBI file, there were badly taken notes on my classes, and recommendations that I be deported and all of that. So a lot of us, a small number of us in criminology were studying police, police intelligence operations, trying to understand how it worked, and also we were very familiar with the incredible number of deaths and setups of people in the Panthers and political organizations. So if you were a leftist active around police stuff and prison stuff, you knew this. You studied it all the time. So in that class, people told me afterwards that a third of the class went, yes, we know exactly what you're talking about. A third of the class were like, what is he talking about? And a third of the class thought I was crazed. So I was glad when I got my FBI file to find hilarious reports on the classroom, that I was one of the first people in the United States to wear my hair long.
Tony, I'd like to turn now to the 30 years that you've spent at Sac State, in which your scholarship has moved away from crime per se into a wide variety of different topics. Yeah. You have tried to bring people's attention to the legacy of Franklin Frazier. You have written a book on entitled Bloodlines, about the history of eugenics. You've written a book called Grave Matters, about the plundering of Native American burial sites. Can you tell us about this? Would it be fair to characterize this as a shift? Is there, in the fact that these are all revisionist histories, do you see this more of a continuity of the earlier work? Can you share with us your reflections on the past 30 years of scholarship that seems to be less focused on crime per se?
So I did teach criminology and continued to work with the journal that we set up after the criminology program was closed down at Berkeley. And I taught it for a while at Sacramento. But it became a very depressing topic to teach from an activist perspective, because the right was all powerful, the left was very weak, defeated. All the left initiatives, from liberal to more radical initiatives, were really all defeated, all gone. And so teaching criminology, whatever the variation of criminology that I was teaching, was just sort of all critique and very little action and very little sense of what to do about it. So I got fairly depressed just by teaching those topics. And I think my students probably found it pretty depressing too, because it's like, you think it's bad? Well, let me tell you how much worse it is, And after a while, when you're teaching critique without any sense of how to move on that critique or get beyond it, it becomes intellectually and politically a bit of a dead end. So that was part of what was going on. I think the second thing was that from the 70s on, early 70s on, I really see myself as a political activist, working in a variety of political organizations, grassroots organizations, Marxist organizations, and so on. And I think if you're a political activist, you have to be very flexible about the work that you do. Because depends on the projects that you're working on and the interventions you're working on. There's a need for different kinds of political work. So you switch different topics and work on different things. But I would say a consistent theme in all the work that I've done, even though I came into areas like, when I did the book on eugenics, I had to study eugenics. I did the book on Native American graves. I had to really deeply study the history of Native Americans and so on. Is that they all have in common that they're revisionist histories, that they take a set of conventional understandings about something and try to unpack that understanding and replace it with a more complicated one. So E. Franklin Fraser, for example, the book I did on Fraser. Fraser was often characterized after his death as the father of the Moynihan Report, the guy that had authored the ideas about the pathological black family and that Moynihan had picked up after he died. And the new generation of black intellectuals and black activists really wanted to have nothing to do with Fraser. And I think when I was doing work for the Riot Commission, working with Skolnick on the politics of protest, I went back to try to read all the different reports that had been written about riots and protests. And I found an unpublished report by Fraser that he wrote on about the 1935 Harlem Report that was just brilliant, you know, critical, leftist, radical. And well, how do you put together the man that wrote this with the guy who's seen as the advocate of the pathological black family? So then I started doing research on him, and when I initially started that idea for that book and went around talking about it, black nationalism was very strong, and people said, you shouldn't be writing about a black intellectual. Black intellectuals should write about black intellectuals, and you know, you may have something to say, but it's not your area to work in that area. You know, somewhat comparable to one of the critiques that's being made of Amy Goffman now for the work that she did on.
This is Alice Goffman's On the Run.
Alice Goffman's book. Yeah, she's getting the same. Like, what's a white woman doing going into a black Philadelphia community, writing about, you know, a young black man on the run? So I stopped working on that book. Okay, fine. I sort of politically agree with that. If the black intellectuals should write about it, want to write about it, they should. So when I came back to that several years later and nobody had written about him, and black nationalism was sort of not totally died out, but it certainly receded, then people were like, that's great, please go ahead and work on it. Everybody was very receptive to me doing that. So that book, a bit like the Juvenile Court book, The Child Savers, is an attempt to revise certain ways of thinking about him, and that's why the book is called E. Franklin Fraser Reconsidered. So I think if you look through the themes of all the writings, they're all historical. They're all about mostly late 19th, 20th century American history, and they all involve some kind of revisionist views of conventional ideas.
Tony, turning to the last section of today's conversation, I'd like to just ask a few overarching questions about looking back over the entire arc of your work and also looking forward. The first one is whether there's anything that you would have to say to young scholars, to future criminologists. In many ways, a lot of young scholars will look to your career as for information about how one lives a life as a radical criminologist, as an activist and an academic.
Or as a warning that if you get too politically involved, you're going to lose your position and status.
That's exactly what I wanted to ask you about. What kind of advice do you have for the precarious life of wanting to be both an observer and a changer of the world? So someone who has taken their theses on Feuerbach really seriously.
Well, I think the world of people going into university careers now is totally different from the world that I went to. I mean, again, as a matter of total luck and serendipity, I started out on an academic career when the university was expanding like crazy, where there were jobs all over the place, when I had choices of jobs, when there were full-time positions, you didn't have to take a lectureship, a part-time job, and so on. So the academic marketplace is totally different, and I think people going through getting their PhDs now and being on the academic market, it is much more difficult to find work, and there are a lot more pressures on you. So I understand that. I understand that difficulty. And I think universities also now put all kinds of pressures on people in terms of getting tenure and job security, the workload, the expectation of publications and peer-reviewed journals and so on. So I think the conditions are different and the pressure is much higher. At the same time, I would say that not to take away from my career that if you bite the hand that feeds you, you're going to have a destroyed academic career. That's not the lesson I take from my life. I've had a very, very interesting, fruitful, creative academic career. I would have liked to have stayed at Berkeley, obviously for all kinds of reasons, but I didn't feel like teaching at Sacramento for all those years was a defeat. It was a very interesting time. I enjoyed teaching there. I enjoyed the students. I learned a whole new field. It was productive and creative. They treated me very well there. So sometimes I think people think that maybe I shouldn't be too politically active or too outspoken or speak out against these trends and so on, because there's going to be consequences. And in a sense, that's true. There are consequences for activism. It's not like you can be an activist and go against the system and say, well, you're guaranteed that nothing will happen to you. But you've got to make your own individual choices about that. And sometimes I think young people assume that there's going to be more of a crackdown than there actually is. We're not living in a fascist society. We're still living in a society where there's a lot of space for different kinds of ideas and different ways of teaching and different ways of thinking. And sometimes I think people overly self-censor than they need to. So that would be one thing. And the second thing is, and I think in some ways this is very difficult, because I think criminology is a very interesting topic because it's at these crossroads of very important political, economic, social, cultural issues in society. It's one of the reasons why I find it a fascinating topic. Because you're dealing with the state, you're dealing with power, you're dealing with definitions of deviance and crime, you're dealing with institutions of power. I mean, you're really in the middle of very important stuff about how a society is run. So the topics of criminology that bring people into this field are very, very important. But the challenge is how to develop an interdisciplinary analysis and comparative analysis that allows us to have a sophisticated understanding of those issues, because I don't think you can just be boxed into a narrow criminological discipline. I think you need to have a lot of different kinds of training and knowledge, and that's a challenge to get that intellectual heft that you need to do the work. And secondly, I think the turn against history in criminology and criminological training, I think, is very dangerous. I think one of the most exciting moments, not just politically, but intellectually, was in the 70s when the big ideas came in, a lot of them historically based. Foucault, Rusch and Kirkheimer, later on the work of Stuart Hall and the Birmingham group, the Scandinavian activists and theorists and so on, that brought in a deep sense of history and a sense that you cannot understand what's going on in criminal justice unless you have that. I think criminology training and criminology programs not only sort of purge the radical ideas or co-opted them, in fairly mindless ways, but also then emphasize policy analysis, quantitative analysis, the here and now, so that criminology would continue to be relevant to people in power. And when I've been invited back, and now at the Law and Society Center as a sort of a visiting research professor there, which I'm very glad to be at Berkeley. And I wanted to I'm working on a new project that involves history, and I wanted to hire a doctoral student to work with me. And so I asked for different names, and people came back and says, well, there's only 2 people that we know in any year of the program that are doing any kind of historical work or have any interest in that. One is you, and the other is Chase Burton, and they said, there's nobody else. There's nobody else doing that kind of work. I think when I talk to people doing criminology work in other places, and when I read this wonderful new set of literature that's come out in the last 5 years, very critical of mass incarceration and misuse of police power and so on, its historical analysis is very shallow. That people talk about police militarization being a new problem. Whereas if you read any history of policing back to the 19th century, you know that militarization was a central part of what the police did right from the very beginning. So the lack of history, the lack of serious interdisciplinary intellectual work, and the lack of sort of a more courageous practice, I think, is a problem in criminology.
I have another question about as you put it, the turn away from history in criminology.
Yeah.
But before I ask that, I just want to wrap up on the note to young scholars. In 1988, you wrote an article with the title, "If We Know, Then We Must Fight," a quotation from James Baldwin,
Yeah.
"The Origins of Radical Criminology in the United States." Here's the quotation. "The theoretical weaknesses of radical criminology were in part the result of an emphasis on short-term activism and idealist expectations about the impact of social protest on established political structures."
Yeah, easy to say after the fact.
This has been, just a few days ago, we marked the 1-year anniversary of Michael Brown's death. There has been, at least from the vantage point of Berkeley, it appears a groundswell of impressive movements to draw attention to race relations in America.
Yeah.
You were mentioning police militarization.
Yeah.
The effect of power, the opacity of power in America at the moment.
Yeah.
When you look at these movements, typically led by a younger generation,
Yeah.
what do you think, as someone who is a seasoned veteran of activism? What's your view towards this? Do you have anything to say about those movements, or even to young scholars in criminology who are very attuned to those movements themselves?
I'm excited by it. I mean, one of the reasons I've sort of come back into criminology and trying to write about the history now of criminal justice is because there are now, once again, social movements at the grassroots level taking on these issues. Those movements are, for the most part, decentralized, local, led by young people, not with, as far as I can tell, close ties with any kind of institutional forms of power in the Democratic Party, in the churches, in the old civil rights organizations, in the university, much more autonomous, much more local. And it's unclear whether this is the beginning of a prairie fire or whether it's going to end and other things are going to happen. But certainly, this is definitely a moment where grassroots activism, plus events like 2 years ago, the hunger strike and the over solitary in the prisons up in Pelican Bay in Northern California, that had widespread reach into Europe and other parts of the world. This is the beginning of something. Now, whether this develops and builds and grows, we don't know. But this is certainly a good moment for people in criminology who consider themselves progressive to think about work that they can do with community organizations. And I was really struck at the annual meeting of the American Society of Criminology last year in San Francisco. I was on a radical panel, I think on the first day at 8 o'clock in the morning, and I thought, oh, classic, they've put us at the time slot and on the first day when nobody will come to it. And the room was full. And, I participated in 2 or 3 other events and the rooms were full. And there's going to be a national conference next year on sort of directions in a new critical or radical criminology, which looks very promising and exciting. So I think this is a moment where a lot of people out there who now feel like they can tie their ideas in criminology to things happening out in the community, that this is a possibility. Will it build into something more profound and change? You can't foretell that. You never know.
The question about history in criminology. Begging your pardon, I'm going to do one more quotation. This is the last one, I promise. Okay. This one is from an article that you published more recently in 2011, the title of which was Crossroads for the American Carceral State. This appeared in the Troy Law Review.
Yeah.
When referring to congressional commission that was going to be assembled to review the state of criminal justice in the face of declining incarceration rates, or plateauing, more accurately, incarceration rates. You wrote, "The bad news is that the creation of a commission is likely a ruse to delay hard choices and avoid debate, and that its findings, the commission's findings, are predictable."
That commission never happened.
Yeah. Has history made you a pessimist?
There's the old quote from Gramsci that leftists always bring up in moments like this, which is we have to have optimism of the heart and pessimism of the mind. And I think that's a fairly, still a useful adage. Optimism of the heart means that it's a belief system, a belief that human societies can do a better job than what we've done in the past. I mean, this is sort of the top moment in human history of sort of, if we've reached the top moment in human progress, then then it's all over. Then there's no, yes, you become profoundly depressed and so on. But from various examples from history, and particularly activist examples and people trying to seize power and change relations, you believe that there's totally different ways that human beings can relate to each other. That's an optimistic view. It's a bit like a religious belief system, because we haven't had societies that have actually done that, though we've had insights into it from different kinds of experiments. And the pessimism comes from always having a critical mind. This is where I totally agree with Jerry Skolnick that when you're a leftist and an activist, you don't give up your mind. You need an even sharper mind, because the consequences are greater. You're trying to do an analysis of what you're up against, how you fight it, how you can take it on, and the consequences of that analysis can affect people's lives and communities' lives. So you need to be really on it in a very, very sharp way. Since that quote that you gave me, I wrote that 3 years ago, right, 3 or 4 years ago, and the changes are extraordinary. I mean, now there's a national political conversation going on about crime and justice. A book seems to come out every 6 months that criticizes mass incarceration and racism and police violence and so on. You have these strange political bedfellows, right, of liberal activists like Van Jones and then political libertarians like Rand Paul and old-style conservatives like Newt Gingrich getting together, as they've done now for like 7 or 8 years, talking about how to reform the criminal justice system. You have Obama finally making speeches about the need for reform. You have grassroots activism going on, or the beginning of a whole grassroots movement. So this is actually a very interesting political movement, and it makes me want to come back and work in this area again, because now you're not just talking to yourself. There's an audience out there. I mean, Michelle Alexander's book, New Jim Crow, has sold about 500,000 copies. Alice Goffman's book it's in paperback after 1 year, being widely promoted and being read by a lot of people. So I think there is a hunger out there for these kinds of ideas, which is, when you see that, you want to grab that moment. So for young criminologists, this is great possibilities here.
Well, you've just mentioned a lot of demand for new scholarship on mass incarceration and the operations of criminal justice. What's the supply you're going to offer? What are some of your own new projects that you're initiating?
So I have a contract with St. Martin's Press, Macmillan's, to turn in a book in the next 18 months. And the proposal is to try to understand the deep historical context of the current crisis, and also to try to show how deeply rooted some of the problems are that we face today. I've been struck by a lot of the contemporary critical literature in criminology and related topics that have come out, that they barely go beyond before the 1970s. That mostly it's very presentist in its orientation. Mass incarceration tends to then get isolated from other sets of issues, which I think is a problem, having to do with specialization in criminology, that you work in police, or you work in prisons, or you work in immigration issues. So I want to try to develop a more holistic analysis of what's going on in the criminal justice system. Also look very deeply at the roots of this. Police militarization, I don't think, is something that comes out of the transfer of weapon systems from Iraq to police departments. It's much more deeply rooted than that. And because this is a reform moment in American society, I want to look at the lessons to learn from the history of reforms in criminal justice, where a lot of things that started off looking pretty good ended up, like the juvenile court and other programs, to be very repressive. So this is a good moment to sum up the lessons of previous efforts at reform. That's how I'm going to try to enter this current national debate.
Okay. Well, Tony, thank you so much for your time. I found it really edifying. I hope future generations of criminologists find it similarly so. My name's Johann Koehler. I've been with Tony Platt, and on behalf of the Oral History of Criminology project, we're signing off.
Thank you very much. Thanks.